Hello and welcome to today's webinar FAFSA walkthrough. My name is Neftali Cabrales-Vick and I am the Manager of College Access and FAFSA Outreach at the North Carolina State Education Assistance Authority. If you're not familiar with us, we are the state agency that helps North Carolina students plan and pay for their education. And we're pleased to bring you the CFNC.org website where you and your students can go for everything you need to know about the college going process. For today's webinar, I have with me Lee Bray, Senior Director of Financial Aid, Veteran Affairs, and Student Resource Centers at Pitt Community College, and she's going to give you an overview of everything you need to know about completing the FAFSA. So Lee, I will pass it on to you.
All right, thanks, Neftali. All right, let me share my screen. And can you see it okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I am going to preface that there are a lot of screens that I'm going to be showing you today, and many of them are going to be repeated. We're going to talk about different scenarios of FAFSA completion, and I'm going to show you in the beginning some of the screens so that you can get used to that. But then once we get to the later scenarios of who is completing the FAFSA, I'm going to very quickly go through those subsequent screens. Since you've already seen the same ones, it's just more about the different types of scenarios of filling out the FAFSA. So just an overview. The first thing, like I said, we're going to talk about different groups of who is completing the FAFSA. So we're going to talk initially about dependent students. So that's students under the age of 24 and inviting their parents to complete the FAFSA. The next thing we're going to talk about is parents starting the FAFSA first for their dependent. Then we're going to talk about independent students or students who do not rely on parental information or that are above the age of 24. Independent students who are single as opposed to married. We're going to look at the actual FAFSA submission summaries. We're going to talk about some different scenarios that you need to be aware of. So dependent students and parent refusals, unaccompanied homeless youth, and provisionally independent students. So we're going to get right into it because there's a lot of stuff to go over. So the first thing that you need to be aware of is the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It's what gets you access at your colleges to any Pell Grant money, which is free money, any state aid. A lot of times institutional scholarships will require the FAFSA, and also student loans if you're interested in those. The 25-26 FAFSA is going to be or became available on December 1st, 2024. So it is available to complete right now. I do want to note that there are two FAFSAs that are currently open right now. The 25-26 FAFSA is the FAFSA that you want to complete if the student will be starting school in fall 2025, spring 2026, or summer 2026. The other FAFSA that is available is the 24-25 FAFSA, and that FAFSA should only be completed if the student is going to be attending in this current spring 25 semester or summer 2025 semester. My recommendation is that if you are unsure of which FAFSA you or the student need to complete, I would just complete both because there is no harm in both of those FAFSAs being completed. All right, so we're going to get right into it. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the actual login screen. So we're going to talk a lot about dependent or independent students. And this is something that the FAFSA is actually going to determine whether a student is dependent or independent. But for a broad overview, a dependent student is a student that is technically under the age of 24, meaning they are dependent on their parents. Even if the student lives outside of the house, has their own job, is obviously moving off to college, typically, if they are under the age of 24 and still have contact with parents, they're going to be considered dependent. Students that I call independent are going to be students above the 24 or older and are not reliant on parental information, so we will not look at them. So again, we'll touch more on that later. The FAFSA actually determines your student's dependency status, but when I say dependent or independent, I just wanted to give you a little idea of what we're talking about. So again, dependent students are going to be logging in. What we call an FSA, user ID and password, is something that a dependent student is going to need to create. The parents are also going to need to create an FSA user ID and password, and these are both going to be separate account logins. It's very important that these are created, I would say at least 3 days prior to completing the FAFSA, because they are run through identity checks. And so you're not going to be able to log into the FAFSA or to sign it if you don't give that 3-day lag time, because what this username and password is used for is your actual signature or electronic signature on the FAFSA. So this is what it looks like. And again, both student and parents are going to have to complete this if the student is under the age of 24. The next thing that it's going to ask is identity information. Again, like I said, this FSA user ID is run through identity verification. The one thing that I want to note here, since the student and parent both have to complete different account setups, the email addresses and the phone numbers have to be different on the accounts. If you try, let's say you're a parent and you try setting up the student's account information and you use the same email address, it is not going to let you do that. Same thing with the phone number. I know as a parent, a lot of the times you want to receive the information so that you know how to keep the student's FAFSA up to date, but you cannot use the same phone number and same email. They have to be different. Other information it's going to ask for that you should be prepared for is date of birth, social security number, and mailing address. All right, so then after you create that username and password and you go into the actual FAFSA to start completing it, you're actually going to have to provide consent to this FAFSA information, or else you won't be able to continue on in the process. This consent is for the IRS to directly pull over any tax information. Now, you may be thinking that since the student is a dependent, they might not have filed taxes, so they don't have any information to be transferred over. But information that the student is what we call a non-filer will also be transferred over. So this consent is actually very, very important, whether or not taxes were actually filed. So once you go ahead and approve for that consent to be given, then this is what it's going to look like when the IRS and the FAFSA are linking up together. This next section is probably the most important section. This is where we start talking about whether the student is going to be considered dependent or independent. And obviously, there is a lot of different circumstances that can be happening in a student's personal life that may affect the FAFSA. So one of the things that you're going to come across is this section of student personal circumstances. What this is going to do is it's going to determine on the financial aid office's side whether we need to ask for additional information, or for the student, it's going to determine whether they need parental information or not. So the first thing that the student is going to see is it's going to ask about their personal circumstances. I know a lot of times it is not ideal situation for a student that they have biological parents that are still married that support them. There may be many other different circumstances. So these questions that you see on the screen right here are to help determine the student's dependency status. So it's going to ask different questions like, is the student currently serving or is a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces? Does the student have children? At the age of any time since the student turned 13. Were they adopted or were they an orphan? Were they a ward of the court? Were they in foster care? It's also going to ask if they were emancipated, which would have to be determined by the courts. And it's also then going to ask if the student was in legal guardianship of someone else. So that may be a parent, or not a parent, excuse me, a grandparent or a relative that assumed legal guardianship or custody over them, or the student is going to select none of these apply. The next thing that it's going to ask is this: if the student was an unaccompanied minor or at risk of being homeless. And so this is very strategic. If a student is living on their own, they're not considered homeless. When we say a student is homeless, it's usually referring to determination by an actual agency that the student is homeless. So this is very important for students that are in high school or just coming out of high school, because there is a specific determination that you would have to prove. If a student has been out of high school for a while and is not in a stable home, they may need to check yes this, yes here, and then we will ask for additional information going forward. But this is another personal circumstance that's going to be asked. And then it's going to ask more about unusual circumstances. So I didn't get into talk about this yet, but there are other reasons why a parent may not be able to provide support or their information for this FAFSA. So there are a whole bunch of scenarios written out on this screen here that the student can select yes or no, again, to determine their dependency status and whether parental information needs to be used on the FAFSA. One thing I want to note that was back on that previous screen: if a student selects yes to any of those circumstances, it will prompt the financial aid offices that you allow access to on the FAFSA to request additional information. So just be prepared that if you select to answer yes to any of those questions, the schools that you send the FAFSA to may ask for additional documentation. If none of those conditions exist, there is then going to be information asked about the parents, because the FAFSA will have determined that you're a dependent student if you're under the age of 24. No special circumstances exist. So now we're going to get into the parental information. So it's going to ask, are they married to each other? And there is a great I believe it's called the Parent Wizard. If you don't know who should be on your FAFSA form, like right here, you see on the green box on the FAFSA form, the parent is the student's legal or biological or adoptive parent. But there is a Parent Wizard on this screen too. If you are confused on who should be completing the FAFSA with you, that you can utilize. And then what you're going to do is the student is actually going to invite the parent to be what we call a contributor. So the only thing that the student is going to do is put in the parent's marital status and then basic demographic information. So date of birth, social security number, and email address. It's very big to note here that the email address that the student uses for this invite should be the same email that the parent is using to set up that initial account, that FSA user ID and password. I also want to note here that for parents who do not have social security numbers, there is a little checkbox right here that you can indicate that your parent doesn't have a social security number. It is then going to ask for an ITIN number, or there is an additional identity process if they don't have socials. But I just wanted to note that here. Once this is completed, then the student is going to go back to their questions, and it's going to ask whether the student filed a tax return. This is where I want to note that even though you are filling out the 25-26 FAFSA, the actual tax year that the FAFSA is looking at is 2 years prior. So for the 25-26 FAFSA, it's going to be looking at 2023 taxes. And it is okay if the student did not file. So here you will just select yes, they did file or no, they did not. Then it's going to ask additional information about the student's tax return status. So if the student did file taxes, it's going to ask these follow-up questions of marital status and then just some other basic questions that you'll want to answer. Most of the other information, if the student did file taxes, is going to be transferred directly over from the IRS. That was the consent that you signed initially. But then the student is almost done. So this process has become a lot easier. But now the student is going to be allowed to select colleges or career schools that they want to have access to the FAFSA. There is no harm in putting a whole bunch of schools on here, but any school that you put on here is then going to be given access to see that FAFSA information. Once the schools are added, then you're going to see this review page that's going to have these really nice check boxes so that the student is aware that each section is complete, or they need to go back and complete something in a section, it will not have a checkbox and they won't be able to continue and sign the FAFSA if all sections aren't complete. Then it's going to give you some releases on signing and completing your section. The student and the parent should read over this information. And then it's going to let you know that the FAFSA has been signed and submitted. You're almost there. The section for the student only is complete. It's important to know that even though the student portion might be complete, that the parent down here was invited as a contributor. And so now the parent actually has to go do their portion. So the parent is going to refer to the email that they would have gotten. And this is actually what it looks like. So this is not the FAFSA information. This is just a snapshot of what the actual email looks like. But the parent is going to go check their email and it'll let you link right to the FAFSA invitation right here. And then once you actually log into the FAFSA with that, your account, the parent's account, not the student's account, the parent has to log in with that FSA user ID that we created way back in the beginning. Then it's going to let you know that whoever the student is has invited them to complete their portion of the FAFSA. And so that's where you want to accept the invitation. I do want to note, and I believe that this is brought up later, but if you decline the invitation or decline consent, the student's FAFSA will not be able to submit it and they will not be considered for any financial aid, including student loans. So just as you saw for the student, once the parent gets past that initial, they accept the invitation, they are going to be giving their consent to have the information directly transferred from the IRS. So again, it's very important that this consent is approved so that the student can move on. This is just more of a deep dive of what the actual it is a very, very long consent that the parents and the students have to read over. And then there's this really nice FAQ section right here. If you want more information on what you're actually giving consent to, how it's used, and what happens if you don't provide consent. But once you hit approve for that, then it's going to ask about the parent demographics just as it did for the student. So you're going to go on and confirm your marital status. And then it's going to ask you about your tax return filing status. Again, don't be concerned that it's asking about the 2023 taxes. Remember that this is something that the FAFSA looks 2 years prior back at the taxes. Then this is something that is different than the student portion that you've already seen. It's going to ask for the family size. And this is something that you should pay attention to because it's already going to start pre-calculating what the family size is based on the exemptions on the tax return. But you want to make sure you read this carefully and include any additional individuals that may be that you may be supporting in the household. Then it's going to ask about how many individuals that you selected that were in your family size are actually attending college. And then you get to the review page. Just like the student portion, the parent is going to see check boxes, but they're not going to be able to see the entire FAFSA. They're only going to be able to see their portion. And once they hit continue, the same consent to sign will come up. And again, with your electronic signature, your FSA user ID and password is that signature. So logging into this, you've already almost pre-signed it. And then you want to just hit sign and submit down here. And then it'll let the parent know that the entire FAFSA form is complete, and then the student will be notified that their form is now in process. Okay, so that was the bulk of the screens, but the next, like I talked about, we're going to be talking about scenarios. So I know a lot of times the parents are going to start the FAFSA before the student. So what we originally looked at was the student completing the FAFSA form first and inviting the parents. But if the parent wants to get a jump on it before the student does, that's what we're going to be looking at now. And again, I'm going to fly through the screens because the screens are all going to be repetitive, but this is just different scenarios. So this is a tad different. Again, this is if the parent is going in before the student. They are going to fill out the student's information. And it's going to, again, talk about the student's identity information. It's going to review the parent identity information. And then it's going to go on to the actual parent consent. So we're skipping the student consent part because the parent's filling this out initially. So we're going to go right into the parent consent. And again, you saw this on the other screen of what the consent looks like and the FAQ questions. And once you approve consent, then it's going to let you know that your IRS tax return information is being imported over. And it is going to ask some additional federal benefits questions. So it's going to ask about like if you receive any free or reduced school lunches, earned income, credits, SNAP, SSI. So you either want to check one of those if they apply to you or check none of the above so you can continue. And again, it's going to ask what the tax filing status is. It's very important to look at who it's asking about. So it'll either say the student or the parent. In this case, since the parent's filling out their portion, it's asking about the parent tax filing status. Then just like it did before, it's going to ask you to confirm your family size, confirm the number who are actually attending college during the particular time period. And then if you didn't transfer the taxes over automatically or you were unable to for some reason, it's going to ask these follow-up questions about the taxes. So it might be helpful to have your 2023 tax return handy when completing this. But this will only populate if the IRS portion wasn't able to be transferred over. It is going to ask a few follow-up questions for the parents on if there was any child support received and asset information. Sometimes this asset information can be slightly confusing. So there's a little help button right here if you have any questions on what should or should not be considered in asset information. And just like it did before, it's going to show you a review screen before you get to the actual signing and submit portion. And then it's going to have the parent sign their portion. And then this is what it's going to look like. The parent section is complete, but it's going to let them know that the student section is not complete and that there are additional requirements for the FAFSA to be submitted. You're also going to get, as the parent, this box right here that says the student will not be able to move forward in the process if the consent is not approved or if they do not do their portion of it. Then once the student section is complete, then this is what they're going to see, that the student can actually go in and complete their section and an email was sent and that it's going to be in process. All right, so the next section we're going to be talking about is independent students with spouses. Again, independent students are students that are typically 24 or older. They are not going to need parental information, but they may be married. And so this is where we're going to talk about how an independent student completes the FAFSA and invites the spouse. As you probably are already guessing, the screens are going to be exactly the same. It is the same as if a dependent student invites a parent, but this time the independent student is going to invite their spouse. So the language is just changing, but the screens are going to remain the exact same. So let's talk about an independent student who is married logging in. Again, this is going to be the same. You're going to select your role as the student. It's going to ask that basic demographic information for identity purposes. It's going to ask your consent and approval. It's going to import the tax return information if there is any. And it is going to go through this personal circumstances just like it did before. Because again, this is one of the other things that's going to determine the dependency status for the student. So the student is always going to see this where the parent and spouse are not. And then here's the message that's going to pop up. It is going to let you know your dependency status. So most of the time this pops up because the student is already identified as being above the age of 24 or older. So it's automatically going to let you know that you're an independent student. And like it says here, this means that you do not need to provide parental information. It is then going to ask again, like we saw before, about the tax filing status. Then it's going to ask again about the family size, the number of individuals in college, and then if the tax return information wasn't imported over automatically, it's going to ask additional filing information. And then it's going to ask about asset information. And again, like I mentioned before, for the parents, most of the time for dependent students, asset questions are not asked because the student is usually below an income threshold where they would even need to ask about assets. But if this pops up, again, there are help buttons right here to help you determine what actually needs to be included in that asset information. And then you're going to invite the spouse if the independent student is married. So again, just like the dependent students and their parents, the email addresses have to be different, the phone numbers have to be different, but the spouse is going to be invited and needs to create their account because if you file taxes jointly with the spouse is going to have to provide their consent that the tax information is being imported over into the student's FAFSA. So this again is just what the invite page looks like. Then it's going to go back to the actual student where they can select the colleges that they want their FAFSA or that they want the FAFSA's access to go to. And it's going to give you that lovely review page again and going to let you know that it was shared with a contributor. In this case, it would be the student's spouse. And then it's going to show you that the spouse's section hasn't been completed yet. And then the student again is going to sign and certify the information that they put on the FAFSA is correct. And the FSA user ID is still going to be the electronic signature for this. Just as before, it's then going to show that the FAFSA section for the student is complete and the spouse was requested as a contributor. Here again is where it shows what the next steps are. And just like it showed before, the spouse that is invited as a contributor is going to get this email. Again, this is not a FAFSA page. This is an email snapshot of what the invite looks like. And if they hit this Get Started button right here, it'll take them directly to the FAFSA. where they can accept the invitation or decline it. And again, it'll give you information on if you decline the invitation or do not consent for your approval on the FAFSA, that will make the student ineligible for any types of financial aid. They'll be unable to move forward in the process. So once the invite is accepted, then the spouse will be able to review their information that was added, provide their consent. Again, this is just an expanded view of what the consent looks like. It's going to let them know that the tax information is being imported over, but it's never going to show the tax information. It's going to ask about the filing status. And if the information didn't get imported over from the taxes, this information will be shown. This is important if you file separately from your spouse. You will need to enter information separately. So this might be a reason why you see these screens. Then it's going to show that review page that those specific sections are marked with a checkbox that they're complete, and then you can, the spouse can go on to signing their portion, which looks like this, just like the others. Once it's signed and submitted, then this is the congratulation page that the spouse is going to receive, and the student will actually receive an email once the entire FAFSA has been completed, letting them know that it is now in process and going to be sent to the schools. Okay, so now the next section is we're going to talk about independent students. So those students that have that are 24 or older or have special circumstances. They're not reliant on parental information, but they're not married, and they're a non-tax filer. This is probably the easiest scenario of the FAFSA that you're going to complete. But again, all these screens are going to be repeated. So the student is going to log on to the FAFSA with their FSA user and ID and password, just like they had for any other sections that we talked about. It's going to verify their identity information. It's going to ask for their consent. It's going to be importing information over. This is important to know. I mentioned it a couple of times, but even if you didn't file taxes in the applicable tax year, it is still importing over that you're a non-tax filer. So it is going to verify that information. It's then going to ask about a student's personal circumstances, like before that it talked about. It is going to verify their marital status. It's going to ask you some additional personal circumstances, because again, this is going to verify that a student is actually independent and does not need parental information. It is going to ask about homeless information again, because that's part of a dependency status. And then just like we showed you on the previous set of questions, it's going to let you know that the student is actually independent and therefore doesn't need parental information. It is also going to ask if you receive any of these federal benefit questions, just like we went over before. Additional information about the tax filing status. But then it's going to jump right to the number in college. It is automatically, unlike the other pages, the FAFSA is automatically going to know that if you're a non-filer, you're an independent student, you're not married, and you don't select that you have any children that you need to support, it's automatically going to assume your number in household. So then you just need to put the number in college, which is most likely just going to be 1, which is the student themselves. Like I said, this one is pretty easy. So it's going to go right to these check boxes again. And then you're going to sign and submit the FAFSA. And you'll get a confirmation page. The one part that we haven't seen so far is once the FAFSA is officially submitted by all parties that are needed, it will come up with this, the information right here that gives you the completion date of the FAFSA, a data release number or DRN number, and also the SAI, the Estimated Student Aid Index. The data release number is important. That may be a number that you give to another school. Let's say that you didn't put a school on your FAFSA that they need access to. If you give the school the DRN number, they can actually request access to the FAFSA. Then this SAI is also important. That's more for financial aid professionals, but this SAI is the number that is used to determine your grant and loan eligibility, as well as some of your scholarship eligibility. All right, so now we're all done with all those different scenarios. Now we're going to get a look at what the FAFSA actually looks like once you submit it. So again, I just talked about this data release number. Don't be concerned if you don't save it initially. This is something that you can always log back on to studentaid.gov and see the FAFSA submission summary once you're in there. So you'll always be able to see this information. It'll show you how many submissions there were, your FAFSA answers, the school submission information, and it'll also indicate if there are next steps. Sometimes that portion will let you know whether the school is going to request additional information. The school information that could be requested, sometimes there is a process called verification that the student might be selected for. It's just a random process that the financial aid office will be required to collect tax information, maybe household information, that will need to be submitted so that the school can determine whether any changes need to be made to the FAFSA. So that's nothing for you to be concerned about. Also, if there were any of those dependency questions that were answered, depending on what school you go to, they may ask for additional proof in the background of your dependency status. If you selected, let's say, at risk of being homeless, we may request information on that. And then under that page, it's also going to give you an estimate of what you might be eligible for financial aid wise. This is only going to show you federal money. So the federal Pell Grant, federal direct loans, and federal work study. This does not include any state information or institutional information. So again, it's just going to be used to determine federal eligibility. You'll really want to look for your school's award letter offer letter that they send out to determine what other types of aid beyond this you might be eligible for. We already talked about this student aid index. Again, this is used for the financial aid office to determine what eligibility to use for determining your Pell Grant, your state grants, and your student loan eligibility. That is all determined by this number here. Again, the next steps, it just talks about understanding tax benefits. There's information about things you should be aware of. And then it tells you there's little areas right here where you can correct any issues on your FAFSA. You can make sure that the school has everything we need, but it's more important that you are looking for your school's automated information that they send out to you for what exactly is needed. So once you actually hit submit on the FAFSA, that doesn't mean you're entirely done. Once you're done with that, then you're going to be looking for those schools that you put on your FAFSA to communicate with you on what exactly is needed, if anything, after the FAFSA is submitted. All right, so what we're going to talk about next is dependent students and the direct unsubsidized only. This isn't something that you saw in the beginning screens, but you want to be aware that when the student is completing the FAFSA, there is a section, and this is exactly what it looks like in the dependency status, that asks if the parents are refusing to provide support, or refusing to provide their information on the FAFSA. I want to be clear that parents refusing their support or information on the FAFSA is different than the student being unable to obtain parental information. This is not a requirement. The student's parents, it is their right to fill out the FAFSA or to not fill it out. But if a parent is refusing to provide their information for the FAFSA, the student is still able to continue on with the process where they would select yes here. But I want to be very, very clear that if you select yes here, then the student is not going to be eligible for any type of free money. They are only going to be eligible for unsubsidized student loans, no state grants. It'll often make them ineligible for any work study or any institutional funding. This is only for parents that are just refusing to provide support. If a student is unable to get a hold of parents, again, that's a different section in the FAFSA, but I want to be very clear that when you're reviewing this information, you want to be very, very alert to what you are reading and what you are selecting yes to here. Most of the time, the students are going to select no here. It does come up with a warning box if you select yes, that you want to apply for unsubsidized loan only because parents are refusing to put their information on the FAFSA. It is going to come up with this additional clarification box because we really want to make sure that the students are understanding what they're selecting. A lot of the times the students, if they're under the age of 24, just don't want to put their parental information on there. And so they select yes, but that's not what the purpose of that is for. The parents really should put their information on there, but again, that is their choice. Another thing we're going to talk about is unaccompanied homeless youth. We did see this initial question of whether the student is considered unaccompanied or considered homeless. And there are specific questions, if you select yes to that, that are going to determine how the student's FAFSA is processed. It's going to ask then, if you're at risk of being homeless and you select yes, it is going to ask whether some director or designee of an emergency shelter has certified that, whether the student's high school has certified that, another agency has certified that, or the actual financial aid administrator, because again, this status of being homeless is something that the school is going to have to document. So whatever you select, we're most likely going to ask for that information on the back end. It is going to give you a provisionally independent status, meaning if you select some of these questions that a student would normally be dependent but can't provide parental information, or they're unaccompanied minor or homeless, it's going to give you this provisionally independent status. And the reason why it's provisional is because the school is going to verify that you should be independent based on those questions that you selected. We're going to verify that on the back end and then make your FAFSA dependency status. We're going to certify that it's either independent or dependent. So again, once you see this, there will be information that you have to send to the schools that you put on the FAFSA in order to complete the overall FAFSA process. That is what I just talked about with this provisionally independent student status. And again, it goes back to any of those unusual circumstances that you select. Most of the times, a school will ask for what we call a dependency override form. Each school has a different process. Some call it a dependency override, some call it unusual circumstances. Whatever the school calls it, they will communicate what is needed with it to document that status. All right, so that is the end of this presentation. I know that that was very quick, but a lot of the sections were repeated. And Neftali, I'm going to stop sharing. And do we have any questions that we can go over?
Yes, Lee. So what if a parent files taxes separately, but they are married? Do both parents have to be included on the FAFSA?
Yes. So if they file separately, but they are married, that is what's going to, if we saw back on previous screens, it does ask the marital status. And if we think logically, if we're trying to transfer information over from the IRS, if there are two separate tax returns, it's not going to be able to do that just from one parent. So if the parent files separately, both parents are going to have to provide their consent, and most likely they're manually going to have to put their information in there. but that is only in the case of the parents being married and married filing separately.
Thank you, Lee. And you covered that the FAFSA uses taxes from prior year, but what happens if a parent has lost their job?
Oh, that's a great question that I forgot to bring up. So if you remember when we showed those sections that talked about unusual circumstances, there is another box that drops down and asks if the financial situation is different, which of course a lot of times it is since you're looking at 2 years prior. A lot of stuff can happen. Your job classification could change. You could have lost your job, and this is for the student or parents. If you select on one of those drop downs that your financial information has changed, what that does is that prompts the schools that have access to the FAFSA to request additional information. So you are going to need to submit the FAFSA based on the tax year that they're asking for. But just know that the financial aid office will then reach out to you in the back end and work with you to look at your current income situation, and the financial aid office will then make any adjustments to the FAFSA to see if it increases your eligibility for any types of grants.
And should a student submit a FAFSA even if they don't think they'll qualify for the Pell Grant?
Absolutely. I love this question because a lot of the times parents or students think that they're not going to be eligible because they're all working and may make decent income. But the first thing I want to let you know is there's no harm to completing the FAFSA. And even if you're not eligible for anything, this does also put you in eligibility range for any institutional scholarships, outside scholarships. They often need the FAFSA to be completed. So even if you're not eligible for the federal Pell Grant, your scholarships may need the FAFSA to be completed. Don't assume that you're not eligible for anything. I have countless stories of students that have thought they weren't eligible, have completed the FAFSA, and actually been eligible for thousands of dollars. Also, if you're thinking about student loans, even though a lot of times when we think of financial aid, we just think of the free money, student loans that come from the Department of Education also need this FAFSA to be completed. So I would recommend anyone complete the FAFSA. There is no harm if you don't complete it, but there is a lot of harm if you there's no harm if you do complete it, but there could be a lot of harm if you don't complete it. So better safe than sorry and just get it submitted.
Thank you, Lee. And can a parent with an ITN complete the FAFSA?
Absolutely. So in that parent contributor invite section, there is that little checkbox I think I showed you that shows where that you can check there. If the parent does not have a social security number, it would then prompt them to enter their ITIN number if they do have that.
And what happens if a parent doesn't consent to FAFSA?
Yes. So as I mentioned a couple of times, it is the parent's option to not consent to the FAFSA, but then that would preclude the student from being eligible or from any types of financial aid, whether it's student loans, state grants, Pell Grants, work study. It would not allow them to continue on in the process. My recommendation would be that if you're hesitant of providing your consent to the FAFSA, have a conversation with the financial aid office. A lot of times we can assuage your fears or answer any questions or concerns you might have about how your information is used.
And what if a parent didn't file taxes?
So if the parent didn't file taxes, that is absolutely fine. There is a section on there that asks whether you did or did not file taxes, and the parent will just simply check they did not file taxes. That will be confirmed with the IRS. And that's actually a good scenario because the lower the income, the more likely that the student is going to be eligible for grants and or that free money. So you can absolutely complete the FAFSA and just select that you do not file taxes, but that is confirmed with the IRS then.
And is the form available in other languages?
Oh, yes. So that FAFSA page that we were showing you screenshots of, you can actually toggle that to switch from English or Spanish, but there's a lot of translation services. So on that page, then, if you need to access the FAFSA or get a translator, they have, oh, Naphtali, I think it's like 30 or it's probably more than 30. There's a ton of other languages that the FAFSA can be translated into, but that initial web page that we were looking at, you can toggle up on the right-hand corner into English or Spanish.
Thank you, Lee. And what does it mean to be selected for verification?
Yeah, so verification, it's nothing that you or the parent did wrong when completing the FAFSA. It is just a random selection process that the schools will let you know what documents the Department of Education is requesting for us to access or request. Usually it's tax information or household size. And what happens then is once we collect that information from you, the financial aid office will review your FAFSA. And if there's anything that was filled out incorrectly or needs updating, we will go ahead and update it for you. So again, it's nothing bad. It's just a random selection that we as administrators have to go on and make sure that the FAFSA was filled out correctly.
Thank you, Lee. And the last question that I had here was how long does it take to fill out the FAFSA?
I forgot to mention. I always forget to mention this up front. So the FAFSA is easier than ever. Like I know that I flew through a lot of these slides, but it is very, very quick. So the students and the parents portion, I mean, I don't think it's going to take you more than 10 minutes to complete. The hardest part is going to be filling out that FSA user ID information. That, like I said, takes about 3 days for your identity to be verified and to get that account information set up. The actual FAFSA takes, I mean, 30 minutes if you're really having trouble completing it. And then the only other time period you're looking at is that the FAFSA does not come to the schools instantly. Once you actually submit the FAFSA, your contributor submits their information and it's being processed. It takes the Department of Education about 3 to 5 business days to process that, and then the schools will have access to it. So there's kind of a whole bunch of different timelines, but I would be safe and reserve about an hour with you and your parent to sit down and complete it, but it's a lot easier now.
Well, thank you, Lee, for all of this information and going over these very important steps for students and their families to be able to access financial aid. And thank you for answering those questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.